Hello, and welcome to With a Little Bit of Luck, Not Getting Stuck After Multi-Year Budget Cuts. My name is Kirsten Davis. I am the Resource Acquisitions Manager at the University of Central Oklahoma. The University of Central Oklahoma is a metropolitan, state-funded institution with a Carnegie classification of professions-focused and a research designation. The current administration is aiming for R2 status. While we're a good 10 years away from that goal, I believe it may be a factor in our budget's recovery, and so is worth noting. The situation here is that enrollment has been declining since FY11, and faculty and staff headcounts are down 20% from FY20 to FY25. The graph on this slide shows the FTE since FY15, which dropped from around 12,750 in FY15 to just over 10,000 in FY22. We've been below 10,000 FTE since FY23. The library's budget was never entirely stable. In fact, it's been best described as a yo-yo. But since FY15, our largest cuts were in FY21 at 19% and FY22 at 15%, for a total of $766,000. The previous acquisitions librarian, and then an interim, saw us through those cuts with input from all of our librarians. However, the change in acquisitions leadership meant that there was no pre-existing recovery strategy when I stepped back into acquisitions in spring of 2023 after a 9-year detour into LIS administration. Despite enrollment dropping below 10,000 FTE for the first time in at least 25 years, in FY23, we were miraculously given a cost of living increase on our largest materials budget line for continuous commitments. The library's executive director had been working on campus support for many years and also wanted me to focus on vendor negotiations. The latter was absolutely necessary. However, I also knew that we would have a budget surplus almost immediately, and so needed a plan for spending funds that do not roll. More on that later. I also had no way of knowing what enrollment would do the following year, nor what we could expect for the budget as a result. Here's an illustration of the yo-yo budgets I mentioned earlier. The lowest line in the graph is our one-time budget, which has been flat since FY21 and was in a long, slow decline for many years prior. The middle line is the library materials share of a student fee and is earmarked for only electronic resources. The fluctuations in that line are due to the university changing the particulars of how it gets divvied up, but our portion has been flat since FY23. The top line is the one that supports continuing resources of all kinds, including print journals and standing orders, and it comes from legislative appropriated funds. This is the line that is most in question in any given year. It is also most reliant on the relationship building done by our executive director. Additionally, this line is affected by the projections we send to the provost each fall for the following 3 fiscal years. The library used to routinely ask for large increases in order to leave negotiating room. However, a realistic forecast lets the provost know exactly how bad a lack of cost of living increase would be, not to mention the impact of cuts. I use any multi-year agreement's actual numbers, and for the rest, use my average uplift from the previous fiscal year plus 2 points to calculate the projection. So if my average was 3.2%, the projection will use 5.2%. As a side note, I calculate my average uplift based only on continuing resources that do not have a flat price due to indefinite contracts. So a database that gets special flat pricing 1 year will be included, but continuing service fees are not. Due to the large number of perpetual collections we have, CSFs would pull the average down and give a misleading impression of the actual increase. Back on topic, we are also lucky that the provost is an academic and big library supporter in general, and she is well aware that aiming for R2 status will mean the library's funding will need to change. Even with the cost of living increases the last few years, that leaves our entire continuing budget reliant on a single funding line. So I'm currently in process of rearranging which subscriptions get paid from which fund to keep those with consistently lower uplifts on the line that has been flat. For example, eventually I plan to have all our continuing service fees on that fund. This also keeps the subscriptions with higher uplifts on the projections for the provost, which means that others can see exactly what might need to be canceled if that budget line is cut. The second strategy is vendor negotiations. While these can be intimidating for new acquisitions librarians, it's very important to always ask. But also, most of us only have so much time and energy to spend on negotiating. So decide on your boundaries for this. I negotiate anything above a plus 3%, with exceptions for consortial agreements and small dollar increases. For example, anything under $500, regardless of the percentage increase, slips through. In this area, multi-year agreements are your friend, since negotiating 1 year then gives you a 2-year break for that resource and/or vendor, since most are 3-year agreements. These are particularly good if you can get a flat rate the first year, but most vendors are going to want a very specific reason, like a big enrollment drop, in order to do a flat rate for a single year. Do be sure to thoroughly check all the math on these. It's very easy for one small error to snowball. Also, make sure to know your institution's rules about financial exigency clauses. One might be required for you to enter into a multi-year, and vendors handle them in a lot of different ways. For negotiating in general, make sure you have all your information ducks in a row so that you can use the information that helps most in a given situation. I have a tracking spreadsheet for budgets, FTE, and faculty staff headcounts that includes the year-over-year percent, as well as 3-year and 5-year changes. And even though our budget is stable for now, I continue to mention that we're still under 10,000 FTE because I fully expect another budget cut if we do not get above that fairly soon. Another side note, I did not track faculty and staff headcount until this year's debacle with the Chronicle of Higher Education starting negotiations with a 20% uplift. That was an entirely egregious ask, and well worth the time it took to gather the numbers to illustrate that their target audience was shrinking on our campus. Now that I have them in my spreadsheet, I will continue to update this information annually along with the budget and student numbers. As mentioned earlier, in FY23, we had a surplus from all the cancellations the prior 2 years, plus a cost of living increase. I was unwilling to add many subscriptions, so we added a few to fill gaps, but largely focused on perpetual purchases to spend the funds. This included converting several JSTOR collections from subscription to perpetual. In FY24, because the perpetual collections went over so well the year prior, and we got a second cost of living increase, I organized a ranked choice vote on perpetual collections that we were interested in. The results of this then gave me the ability to both plan and be flexible in that and following years. Also, having the big picture of what we wanted meant that I was able to ask for bulk discounts from vendors. For example, we were able to buy 3 collections from Redex, where the pre-discount price would have only allowed for 2. Building this perpetual habit has allowed us to add 27 collections plus EBAs from 2 different vendors, which was a new thing for this library, as well as a few hundred individually selected perpetual ebooks. It also gave me room to move some subscriptions into different fiscal years via 18-month payments. Better aligning renewal dates on multiple subscriptions from a single vendor put me in a better negotiating position on a couple multi-year contracts. As the cost of living increases repeated, and we converted all of our JSTOR subscriptions into perpetual, we were also able to continue adding gap-filling subscriptions. Since we'd already gone through the work to determine what subscriptions were most important to keep, I used this as a clean slate. We only restarted one cancellation, the OED, and added new very sparingly. The Ackland Anatomy and APA Style Manual are examples of this. The OED was via a consortium, so we were not punished for canceling by being placed into a higher price bracket, which is a very common practice for a lot of vendors. An anatomy resource was a long-standing gap, and the APA Style Manual was something we'd been hoping for years. By not immediately using subscriptions to spend all of our funds, we easily had space in the budget to accommodate these. Thanks to this out-of-the-subscription box thinking, when faculty requested we support the OA Index fill papers in FY25, that was another easy yes, especially as the library had been supporting archive.org for years already. However, despite that precedence, OA really didn't fit into our existing collection development policy. So I called for a task force that winter, and we drafted a new section based largely on Emory's policy, thank you, Emory, and with inspiration from Brock University, Iowa State, and Spark. We decided to focus on Subscribe to Open and similar programs, as the university is not currently in a position to fund article processing charges, and it sets an unsustainable precedent for the library to begin doing so without an additional financial commitment from the university. We also decided to commit to a small percentage of our fee-based budget line. It was that middle line on that chart earlier. So we went with 3% to OA. Because we are focusing on Subscribe to Open, we will not lose access to resources that we've funded if we are not able to maintain this commitment. For FY26, this commitment came to $17,000, and it was entirely accounted for within a month of the fiscal year's start. Going forward, I will be conducting another perpetual ranked choice vote this spring, and in the summer we'll start that same prioritization process for OA. I'm also hoping to work out a policy for data sets in keeping with the institution's R2 goals. Thank you so much. I have included a link to our collection development policy suite for anyone who's interested, and you are welcome to email me at sdavis63@uco.edu if you have further questions.